Flying at 11,000 feet above German territory, the B-17 Flying Fortress was in its death throes. Flames consumed two of its engines. The cockpit's windscreen lay shattered into fragments. The co-pilot hung limply in his harness, his body pierced by wounds that by all logic should have already killed him. Meanwhile, the pilot maintained his grip on the control column with his right hand, a surface now slippery with a mixture of blood and hydraulic fluid, much of that blood being his own. The aircraft tilted at a 20-degree bank angle, while its airspeed continued dropping below 160 miles per hour. Behind him in the fuselage, 8 men still drew breath. By any reasonable calculation, their chances of survival had already collapsed to zero. That morning, February 20th, 1944, began with a layer of frost coating the hard stands at Ruckham, England. This was Station 468, the operational home of the 305th Bombardment Group belonging to the 8th Air Force. As pre-dawn broke, the temperature hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make fingers stiff and slow down the loading crews who wrestled 500-pound general-purpose bombs into the bomb bays of waiting fortresses. First Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr. made his way across the frozen grass toward his assigned aircraft through the gray half-light that precedes sunrise. 23 years old, slim in build with dark hair, he hailed from Leeds, Alabama, a town so small it barely registered on most state maps. His manner was quiet, belonging to a man who measured his words the way a navigator measures headings, sparingly, with precision, and only when absolutely necessary. The aircraft assigned to him that morning was a B-17G, representing one of the latest production models that featured the chin turret, something earlier fortresses had lacked. This improvement carried real significance. Previous formations had been devastated by head-on attacks from German fighters who ruthlessly exploited the blind spot beneath the nose. The addition of the chin turret changed these tactical calculations, though not completely. The Luftwaffe adapted to new challenges. They always found a way to adapt. Their target was Leipzig, located deep in eastern Germany. The city housed aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants, the industrial organs that kept the German war machine breathing. A mission to Leipzig meant a round trip exceeding 1,200 miles. It required a minimum of 6 hours of flight time, and that was assuming everything proceeded according to plan. It meant crossing the Rhine, penetrating past Hanover, and pushing deeper into defended airspace than most crews had ever ventured. The 8th Air Force had designated this period as _0, over 7 consecutive days. Starting February 20th, American heavy bombers would hammer German aircraft production facilities with unprecedented mass. The strategic logic behind this campaign was brutal, yet coherent. Destroy the factories building Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, and eventually the Luftwaffe would run out of fighters to defend the Reich. The cost would be measured in bombers and the lives of their crews. Lawley climbed through the forward hatch of his fortress and settled into the left seat. Inside a B-17G, the cockpit resembled a cramped cathedral constructed entirely of instruments, switches, and controls. Directly ahead, the main instrument panel presented over 100 gauges and indicators. Engine instruments dominated the center section: manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, and fuel quantity readings for each of the four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. To his right sat Second Lieutenant Paul Murphy, serving as co-pilot. Murphy was relatively new to the crew, still learning the particular rhythms of Lawley's command style. In the B-17, the pilot and co-pilot had to function as a single organism during emergencies. The left seater flew the aircraft. The right seater managed the engines, monitored systems, and handled emergency procedures. If either one became incapacitated, the other had to shoulder everything. Behind and below their positions, the bombardier and navigator occupied the nose compartment. During the final bomb run, the bombardier would take control of the aircraft through the Norden bomb sight, a device so secret that crews received orders to destroy it rather than allow its capture. The navigator tracked their position through dead reckoning, celestial fixes when weather permitted, and radio navigation aids when available. In the waist section, two gunners manned flexible .50 caliber machine guns positioned at open windows. The ball turret gunner folded himself into the cramped sphere beneath the fuselage, rotating to track threats approaching from below. At the extreme rear, the tail gunner sat alone, constantly watching for fighters attacking from 6 o'clock. The radio operator doubled as an additional gunner whenever necessary. 10 men, 1 aircraft, 12 hours of required survival time. The engines coughed to life in sequence, number 3 first, following standard starting order, then number 4, followed by 1 and 2. The sound built from isolated mechanical clattering into a sustained roar that vibrated through every rivet in the airframe and into the bones of everyone aboard. By 0730 hours, the 305th Bombardment Group was airborne and climbing. Over England, formation assembly represented an exercise in controlled chaos. Hundreds of bombers from multiple groups spiraled upward through layers of clouds, each aircraft searching for its assigned position within the combat box. This process consumed both time and fuel, two commodities that would matter desperately later in the mission. The combat box formation was the 8th Air Force's tactical answer to German fighter tactics. By clustering bombers together tightly, each aircraft's defensive guns could provide covering fire for its neighbors. These overlapping fields of fire created a theoretical zone of mutual protection. In practice, however, the formation only worked when it remained intact. Any straggler became easy prey. Lawley's aircraft found its designated position within the 305th formation as the group crossed the English coast near Great Yarmouth. Their altitude stood at 23,000 feet and still climbing toward the planned bombing altitude of 26,000 feet. At that altitude, the temperature measured approximately minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. In such cold, exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Oxygen masks became crusted with ice formed from exhaled moisture. Gun mechanisms thickened and jammed. Human errors multiplied as hypoxia crept into the edges of consciousness. The waist gunners stood at open windows, the wind cutting through their heated suits with brutal efficiency. The ball turret gunner rotated slowly in his glass and steel sphere, constantly scanning the sky below for the first sign of approaching fighters. The formation droned eastward across the North Sea. What awaited them over Germany represented the largest concentration of air defense fighters in history. The Reich's Luftverteidigung, the Reich air defense system, had evolved into a sophisticated network of early warning radar, ground control interception, and mass fighter response. German controllers tracked incoming bomber streams from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast, vectoring fighters to intercept at optimal attack positions. The American formations would face BF-109s and FW-190s in numbers ranging from dozens to hundreds, depending on the target and weather conditions. The fighters would attack in successive waves, pressing through the defensive fire, working to break apart formations and isolate damaged bombers for destruction. Escort fighters could help, but range limitations meant the bombers flew alone for significant portions of each mission. The P-47 Thunderbolts had sufficient range to reach partway into Germany. The newly arriving P-51 Mustangs could penetrate farther. But even with escorts present, the bombers bore the primary weight of their own defense. Lawley had flown through this gauntlet before. He understood that survival wasn't about individual skill, but about collective discipline, holding formation position, maintaining altitude, refusing to flinch when the fighters came. The Channel crossing completed without incident, the formation began its overland transit. Below them, the brown and gray patchwork of occupied Europe slid past, the Netherlands first, then Germany proper. Flak batteries announced the bombers' passage with black puffs of smoke that appeared suddenly and silently, then burst with delayed concussions that rocked the aircraft violently. The first fighter attacks materialized near the German border. Specks appeared at the edge of visibility, quickly coalescing into recognizable shapes as they closed the distance. These were single-engine fighters climbing toward the formation from below and ahead, the standard Luftwaffe approach. They would build speed in a dive, convert it into a climbing attack, slash through the formation, and escape before defensive fire could concentrate effectively. The gunners aboard Lawley's Fortress opened fire as the first wave came into effective range. The sound inside the aircraft transformed from engine drone to violent hammering as the .50 calibers began cycling rounds. Brass casings cascaded across the deck plates. Smoke and the sharp smell of cordite filled the fuselage. The fighters flashed past in seconds, too fast to track accurately, too brief to aim with precision. Shooting at a fighter crossing at 400 miles per hour with combined closure speeds represented an exercise in probability rather than precision. You filled the air with bullets and hoped physics favored your geometry. The first wave passed without causing visible damage to Lawley's aircraft, but the mission was barely half complete. If this history matters to you, consider tapping like and subscribing to WW2 Combat Sky. William Lawley had been flying since before the war transformed pilots into a strategic commodity. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in December 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor transformed American indifference into national mobilization. His path to the cockpit appeared unremarkable when viewed in aggregate. Thousands of young men from small towns followed similar trajectories, but the specific details mattered greatly. He completed primary flight training in the open cockpit Stearman biplane, learning to feel the aircraft through the seat of his pants before the instruments made complete sense. The Stearman taught reflexes and punished hesitation mercilessly. Students who survived this training learned to trust their hands and feet before trusting their eyes. Basic training followed in the BT-13 Valiant, a heavier aircraft featuring a closed canopy and more complex systems. Then came advanced training, transition to multi-engine aircraft, and finally, assignment to heavy bombers. The B-17 bore no resemblance to the trainers. The Fortress demanded crew coordination in ways that single-pilot aircraft couldn't approximate. The aircraft commander wasn't a solo performer, but rather a conductor, managing 10 specialists, each one essential to the whole. The aircraft commander had to understand navigation, bombardment, gunnery, communication, and engineering sufficiently to make critical decisions when those specialists were wounded, frozen with cold, or dead. Lawley demonstrated competence without flash or dramatics. His instructors noted his methodical procedures and conservative decision-making approach. He followed checklists completely without shortcuts. He called out altitude and airspeed changes to his co-pilot even when the other pilot could clearly see the instruments himself. He briefed his crew before every mission with the same level of detail, regardless of whether the target was familiar or new. These weren't the qualities that produced aces or generated publicity photographs. They were the qualities that kept 10 men alive through what should have been statistical impossibility. By February 1944, Lawley had accumulated experience across multiple missions over occupied Europe. Each mission added knowledge that couldn't be taught in any training program. The specific feel of flak bursting close enough to smell, the visual signature of fighters setting up for a frontal attack, the distinctive sound of machine gun rounds striking the aluminum skin of the aircraft. He had come to understand that the B-17 was simultaneously both durable and fragile. Durable because its airframe could absorb extraordinary punishment and continue flying. Fortresses had returned to England with entire tail sections shot away, with dozens of holes punched through the wings, with engines burning and control surfaces missing. The aircraft's redundant systems, 4 engines, when only 2 were needed to maintain flight, dual control cables, multiple fuel tanks, provided margins that saved crews who would have died in less robust machines. Yet it was also fragile because the men inside remained soft flesh enclosed in a metal shell. A single bullet striking the right place could kill instantly. Cold killed slowly, but just as certainly. Fire killed terribly. The aircraft might survive damage that its crew could not. Lawley had witnessed both outcomes. He had watched other fortresses fall from formation, trailing smoke, spinning, disintegrating in mid-air. He had seen parachutes blossom from stricken aircraft, and he had seen missions where no parachutes appeared at all. He had landed back in England with wounded crewmen aboard, and he had taxied past hard stands where aircraft that departed that morning would never return. This experience didn't make him fatalistic. It made him precise. His pre-flight procedures became rituals of survival. He personally inspected control surfaces before every mission. He verified fuel loads against planned consumption rates. He reviewed emergency procedures with his crew until the responses became automatic reflexes. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Murphy, was newer to the war. Murphy had completed the same training pipeline but lacked the accumulated hours of combat exposure. He was competent and eager, still learning the gap between peacetime proficiency and wartime necessity. Lawley worked to close that gap through repetition and leading by example rather than through lectures. The other 8 crewmen represented the same mixture of experience and inexperience that characterized most 8th Air Force aircraft by early 1944. The gunners knew their weapons intimately. The navigator had developed instincts for dead reckoning when clouds obscured the ground below. The bombardier had practiced bomb run procedures until he could execute them under fire without conscious thought. Together, they formed a functioning unit aboard an aircraft designed for precisely one purpose: delivering bombs to targets despite enemy opposition. The Leipzig mission would test whether that design and that unit could survive when its margins were exceeded. The standard B-17 crew procedure for surviving fighter attacks was deceptively simple. Hold your position, maintain altitude, and trust the formation. Individual evasion proved worse than useless. A pilot who broke formation to dodge one fighter exposed himself to every other fighter waiting specifically for stragglers. The combat box worked only through discipline, the collective sacrifice of individual survival instinct for mutual protection. Lawley had internalized this logic across his previous missions. He had held position when every nerve in his body demanded that he dive for the protective cover of clouds. He had maintained altitude when aircraft ahead of him exploded and scattered debris through the formation. He had trusted the gunners behind him to handle threats he couldn't see while he focused on flying precise formation. His previous missions had taught him the specific rhythms of German fighter tactics. The first wave probed for weak points in the formation. The second wave exploited those weaknesses. The third wave finished the destructive work. Controllers on the ground vectored fresh fighters to intercept, while the first attackers returned to base for fuel and ammunition. The assault continued in relays, maintaining pressure across hundreds of miles. The American response was simply endurance. Bombers that survived the initial attacks usually survived the entire mission. Fighter coverage improved as the bomber stream penetrated deeper, with relay escort fighters picking up coverage where earlier escorts ended. The key was surviving the initial penetration phase without losing formation integrity. Lawley's crew had managed this successfully on previous missions. They had taken damage. Every veteran crew accumulated patches and field repairs, but they had brought their aircraft home each time. The statistics favored them somewhat. Survival rates improved with experience, as crews learned lessons that training couldn't teach. But statistics described averages, and individual missions were not average events. The February 20th mission to Leipzig represented a concentration of risk that exceeded normal parameters. The target lay deeper than usual. The expected opposition would be heavier than usual. The weather promised to complicate both navigation and fighter interception. During the briefing, officers had acknowledged the difficulty without embellishment. They had outlined the expected fighter opposition. Over 200 German aircraft were estimated to be available for defensive operations. They had reviewed escort coverage, P-47s to the German border, then a gap, then P-51S, picking up coverage near the target area. They had discussed abort criteria, rally points, and emergency procedures. None of it prepared crews for what waiting actually felt like. The cruise to target became an exercise in psychological management. Hours of engine noise and penetrating cold and mounting fear, with nothing to do but scan the sky and wait. Gunners rotated their turrets in slow arcs, searching for the specks that would resolve into enemy aircraft. Pilots monitored instruments and formation position continuously. Everyone wondered when the next attack would come. Lawley maintained his formation position with the unconscious precision of accumulated habit. He flew approximately 15 feet off the right wing of the aircraft ahead, matching every altitude change in turn with adjustments so smooth that observers might have assumed autopilot control. But the B-17 had no autopilot sophisticated enough for formation work. Every correction was manual, the product of constant attention and immediate response. The aircraft burned fuel at approximately 180 gallons per hour at cruise power, all four engines combined. The mission profile called for approximately 8 hours of flight time, with margins built in for weather, combat maneuvering, and the inevitable inefficiencies of formation flying. These margins were thin. Combat operations consumed extra fuel that planning assumptions often failed to capture adequately. Evasive maneuvering burned more fuel than straight and level flight. Climbs consumed more than descents. The actual fuel state at any given moment represented an estimate rather than a certainty. Lawley monitored the fuel gauges with the same attention he devoted to formation position. The first hours passed without major incident. Scattered flak tracked the formation across occupied territory. Fighter contacts came and went, probing attacks that failed to break the combat box. The formation held its integrity. Leipzig appeared on the navigation charts as the formation commander began approach procedures for the bomb run. The bomb run represented the most dangerous phase of any mission. For the final minutes before bomb release, the formation flew straight and level at constant altitude and airspeed, predictable, vulnerable, unable to evade. The bombardiers needed stable platforms for accurate aiming. The flak gunners on the ground knew exactly where the bombers would be and when they would be there. The aircraft shuddered as flak bursts walked through the formation with methodical precision. Black puffs appeared ahead, beside them, above them, shells exploding with delayed fuses set to the estimated altitude of the bomber stream. Each puff represented shrapnel, hundreds of metal fragments slicing through the air at velocities sufficient to penetrate both aluminum skin and human flesh. Lawley's fortress took hits, but remained airborne. The bombardier called "Bombs away!" The aircraft lurched upward as thousands of pounds of ordnance fell free, the sudden weight reduction changing the flight characteristics until the pilot compensated. The formation began its turn for home, and that was precisely when the German fighters returned in overwhelming force. The attack developed from a 12 o'clock high. The geometry was textbook classic. Fighters dove through the formation on a frontal intercept, converting altitude into speed, presenting minimal target profiles to the defensive gunners, closing at combined velocities exceeding 500 miles per hour. At that closure rate, a gunner had approximately 4 seconds of effective engagement time before the fighter flashed past. 4 seconds to acquire the target, track it, aim, and fire. The mathematical odds heavily favored the attacker. The first pass struck Lawley's fortress with catastrophic effect. Cannon rounds, 20-millimeter explosive shells rather than rifle-caliber bullets, tore through the forward fuselage. The windscreen shattered instantly. Cold air blasted into the cockpit at 250 miles per hour, carrying with it the scream of the slipstream. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Murphy, slumped forward in his harness, struck by fragments that penetrated both his flight suit and his body. Simultaneously, rounds impacted the No. 3 engine, the inboard right, penetrating the cowling and igniting fuel within the nacelle. Fire erupted immediately, visible through the shattered windscreen, orange flames streaming backward in the violent slipstream. The No. 1 engine, outboard left, was also hit. Oil pressure dropped immediately to zero. The propeller began windmilling uselessly as the internal mechanism seized. In less than 5 seconds, the aircraft lost half its power plant. The immediate flight dynamics became brutal beyond description. The asymmetric thrust from the two functioning engines on the right wing, working against the dead and burning engines on the left, created a yawing moment that pushed the nose left and drove the aircraft into a descending spiral. Lawley's hands and feet responded before conscious thought could organize the situation into coherent analysis. He applied right rudder to counter the yaw, pressing the pedal against the firewall to generate maximum opposing force. He added right aileron to level the wings against the rolling tendency. He pushed the control column forward to lower the nose and maintain airspeed, trading precious altitude for the energy needed to stay flying. The aircraft responded, but only partially. His control inputs arrested the spiral, but couldn't restore anything resembling normal flight. The burning engine continued trailing fire like a banner. The dead engine dragged the left wing downward. The two functioning engines labored at maximum continuous power, straining against the asymmetric load with every revolution. Altitude was falling rapidly. The aircraft had begun the engagement at approximately 26,000 feet. Within seconds of the attack, it was descending through 24,000 feet, then 22,000. The rate of descent measured approximately 1,000 feet per minute, survivable for now, but mathematically certain to impact terrain eventually. Lawley assessed the situation with the trained reflexes developed through accumulated emergency procedure practice. 2 engines inoperative, fire on number 3, control surfaces responding but severely compromised, co-pilot unconscious or dead, impossible to determine which in the moment, unknown damage to systems throughout the aircraft, crew status unknown. The emergency procedure for engine fire in a B-17 was crystal clear. Feather the propeller to stop rotation. Cut fuel flow to the affected engine, activate the fire extinguisher, and hope the flames died before structural failure occurred. Lawley reached for the feathering controls with practiced motion. The number 3 propeller refused to feather. The mechanism was damaged, whether by the same cannon fire that ignited the engine or by subsequent heating from the fire itself. There was no time to determine which. The propeller continued rotating in the slipstream, fanning the flames like a bellows, generating drag that worsened the asymmetric handling characteristics. The fire extinguisher discharged into the nacelle with a hiss. The flames flickered briefly, but didn't die. The extinguisher's capacity was designed for initial suppression, not sustained firefighting. If the fire wasn't extinguished in the first seconds, it likely wasn't going out at all. The aircraft had effectively become a flying crematorium. Fire in a B-17 represented the crew's deepest fear, more than fighters, more than flak. The aircraft carried over 2,000 gallons of aviation gasoline distributed across multiple wing tanks. If the fire spread from the engine nacelle into the wing structure, the fuel would ignite. The subsequent explosion would be instantaneous and total, leaving nothing but falling debris. Standard doctrine for uncontrollable engine fire was unambiguous. Abandon aircraft immediately. The aircraft commander held authority to order bailout. The crew had practiced the procedure repeatedly. Each man had an assigned specific exit, a specific sequence, a specific priority. The bailout alarm would sound. The crew would move to their positions, They would jump in order, parachutes opening, falling toward either capture or concealment, depending on luck and location. Lawley knew the doctrine intimately. He also knew that the co-pilot was wounded and unconscious. Murphy couldn't bail out on his own. He couldn't unfasten his harness, move to an exit, or pull his ripcord. If the crew abandoned the aircraft, Murphy would burn with it, still strapped in his seat. The decision point crystallized in a matter of seconds. Lawley could order bailout, save 8 crewmen including himself, and accept Murphy's death as the unavoidable cost of following proper emergency procedure. No one would question such a decision. The doctrine was clear. The situation was textbook. Or he could refuse to bail out. He could continue flying a burning aircraft with only 2 engines, severely damaged controls, and rapidly falling altitude. He could attempt to reach friendly territory, or at least territory where a crash landing wouldn't guarantee immediate capture. He could gamble 10 lives on his ability to keep a dying aircraft airborne. The mathematics were decidedly not favorable. Distance to the English coast, approximately 400 miles. Altitude available, perhaps 20,000 feet and falling steadily. Time before the fire reached the fuel tanks, unknown but measured in minutes rather than hours. Fuel remaining, marginal for the original mission profile, now critical with 2 engines dead and inoperative. Every calculation pointed toward the same conclusion. Bail out. Accept the loss. Save who you can save. Lawley did not order bailout. The decision was physical before it became moral. He tightened his grip on the control column and held the aircraft against the forces attempting to tear it apart. The rudder pressure required maximum leg strength sustained continuously without relief. The aileron pressure demanded constant arm tension. The coordination between hands and feet had to remain precise even as cold air blasted through the shattered windscreen at temperatures far below zero, even as his strength began to fade. He was bleeding. The same cannon fire that had wounded Murphy had also struck Lawley. Fragments had penetrated his left hand, his arm, and his face. The wounds were not immediately fatal, but they were far from trivial. Blood streamed across his flight suit and made the control column increasingly slick beneath his fingers, making his grip more precarious with each passing minute. The aircraft continued burning. The number 3 engine fire had not yet spread to the wing tanks, but the flames continued streaming from the nacelle, clearly visible to any observer in the formation and certainly visible to the German fighters still circling the area like sharks. A burning bomber represented a marked target, wounded prey. Fighters would inevitably return to finish the kill. Altitude passed through 18,000 feet. Lawley assessed his options with the strange clarity that extreme circumstances sometimes impose on the mind. He could not climb. The available power from just 2 engines was insufficient to overcome drag and maintain altitude simultaneously. He could only trade altitude for distance, descending gradually while covering ground toward the west, toward home. The navigation problem was severe and complex. The original course to Leipzig and back had been carefully planned for a formation following prescribed routes at prescribed speeds. Lawley was now flying alone off course at a different altitude with no external references for determining position. The navigator would have to establish their location through dead reckoning, estimating position based on last known location, heading, and time elapsed, a process prone to accumulating errors. The crew began checking in over the intercom system. Voice communications within the aircraft allowed Lawley to assess status without leaving his position at the controls. The reports came in fragmentarily, each man accounting for himself and his immediate area of responsibility. The tail gunner reported he was wounded but still functional. The ball turret gunner reported his position remained intact. The waist gunners had taken shrapnel hits but remained at their stations. The radio operator was attempting to establish contact with any available ground station. The navigator was working frantically on the position problem. Murphy remained unconscious and unresponsive. The co-pilot's wounds were bleeding visibly. His oxygen mask had been displaced during the attack, meaning he was breathing the thin air of high altitude without supplemental oxygen. At 18,000 feet, time of useful consciousness without oxygen was approximately 30 minutes. After that threshold, brain damage would begin. Death would follow inevitably. Lawley could not reach Murphy's oxygen system from his own position without releasing the controls. The aircraft would enter a fatal spiral within seconds of control release. The physical geometry of the situation represented a perfect trap. Lawley was pinned in his seat by the constant control inputs required to keep the aircraft flying. He could not help Murphy directly. He could not move even slightly. He could only fly, maintaining pressure on the controls with failing strength. Another crewman moved forward to help. The top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Henry Mason, left his position and entered the cockpit compartment. He immediately saw Murphy's desperate condition. He reconnected the displaced oxygen mask carefully. He applied first aid to the worst of the visible wounds as best he could in the cramped space. He did what Lawley physically could not do. The intervention bought precious time for Murphy, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem facing them all. The aircraft was still descending inexorably, still burning, still hundreds of miles from any safety. Altitude passed through 15,000 feet, then continued falling. The lower altitude brought warmer air, relatively speaking, and denser atmosphere. The engines could draw more oxygen from the denser air, improving power output marginally. But the lower altitude also brought the aircraft closer to the effective range of light flak batteries. Below 10,000 feet, small-caliber anti-aircraft guns could engage effectively. Below 5,000 feet, even rifle fire from the ground could prove dangerous to an aircraft. Lawley had to balance altitude against distance in a constantly shifting equation. Higher altitude meant greater safety from ground fire, but faster fuel consumption and more difficulty maintaining flight with the damaged engines. Lower altitude meant greater fuel efficiency and easier flight control, but dramatically increased vulnerability to ground defenses. He chose a compromise approach, descending gradually rather than diving, trading altitude for westward progress at a rate that might, just might, allow them to reach friendly territory before the fuel ran out completely. The fighters came back with renewed aggression. They had seen the burning engine clearly. They had watched the aircraft dropping from the formation. They knew exactly what a straggler meant. Easy prey. The attack came from the rear quarter, the standard finishing angle against crippled bombers. The tail gunner opened fire immediately, his .50 caliber tracers reaching toward the incoming fighters in arcing streams. The ball turret rotated to engage as the fighters entered his field of fire. The waist gunners added their fire as the attackers passed through their fields of view. The B-17's defensive armament represented its final protection against destruction. 13.50 caliber machine guns distributed strategically across the aircraft created overlapping fields of fire that made approach hazardous for attacking fighters. The individual probability of hitting a fast-moving target remained low, but the aggregate effect proved suppressive. Fighters had to fly through sheets of fire to press their attacks home. This attack pressed through with determination. Additional rounds struck the aircraft from multiple angles. The damage accumulated relentlessly. More holes punched through the fuselage, more systems compromised, more crew members wounded. The ball turret reported hydraulic failure. The mechanism could no longer rotate under power. The turret gunner had to crank the turret manually to the position that would allow him to exit if necessary, an exhausting process at altitude. The attack finally passed. The fighters broke off their assault, whether from damage they'd sustained, ammunition exhaustion, or reassignment to other targets. Lawley couldn't know and didn't have time to wonder. The immediate threat receded temporarily. The long-term threat remained as dire as ever. Altitude passed through 12,000 feet. The English coast still lay over 300 miles distant. The crew's survival now depended entirely on two factors: geography and fuel. Lawley flew the aircraft westward with the mechanical persistence of a man who had reduced his entire world to a single task: hold the heading, manage the power carefully, monitor the fuel gauges constantly. Everything else became irrelevant. The burning engine eventually exhausted its fuel supply. The flames died when there was simply nothing left to burn. The nacelle remained blackened and severely damaged, but the immediate fire threat finally ended. Critically, the structural integrity of the wing remained intact. The fire had not reached the main fuel tanks. The aircraft was still flyable, at least in theory. 2 engines, 12,000 feet altitude, 250 miles to the coast. The mathematics had improved marginally from impossible to merely improbable. 2 engines at lower altitude could theoretically maintain level flight if the pilot managed power and speed with absolute precision. The fuel consumption would be lower than at combat altitude. The odds shifted slightly in their favor, from certain death to possible survival. But new problems emerged immediately to replace the old ones. The hydraulic system was failing progressively. The B-17 used hydraulics for critical systems, landing gear extension, brakes, and flap deployment. Without hydraulic pressure, the landing gear would have to be lowered manually through a time-consuming hand-cranking procedure that required crew members working in careful coordination. The brakes would be severely degraded or entirely absent. The flaps might not extend at all. Landing a B-17 without functional brakes or flaps was theoretically possible, but dramatically more difficult in practice. The approach speed would be dangerously higher. The landing roll would be much longer. The aircraft would need a long, unobstructed runway, not always available even at English bases. Lawley added this complication to his mental list of problems to solve later. The immediate priority remained unchanged: reach England, reach safety, keep flying. The formation had long since disappeared ahead. The other aircraft of the 305th Bombardment Group had continued their egress route, unable to slow down to match the crippled fortress's reduced speed without endangering themselves and their own crews. Lawley was now alone over Germany, then alone over occupied Holland, then alone over the cold expanse of the North Sea. The escort fighters found him somewhere over the Dutch coast. P-47 Thunderbolts appeared seemingly from nowhere, American aircraft returning from their own escort missions with fuel to spare. They spotted the lone fortress trailing smoke and immediately formed a protective screen around it like guardian angels. The escort couldn't repair the damage to Lawley's aircraft. They couldn't add fuel to his dwindling tanks. They couldn't fly the aircraft for him or take over the exhausting physical effort of maintaining control. But they could intercept any German fighters that might pursue the crippled bomber toward the coast. They could provide that critical margin of safety that allowed Lawley to focus entirely on the act of flying. The English coast appeared on the horizon, at first simply a line of darker color against the gray, resolving gradually into recognizable cliffs and beaches and the familiar patchwork of fields beyond. The sight carried no emotional weight in that moment. There was still too much left to do, too many things that could still go wrong. But the crew members who could see it through their windows understood what it meant. They had reached friendly territory. The question now was whether they could actually land. The hydraulic system pressure had dropped to absolute zero. The landing gear indicator showed all three gear still in the up and locked position. The crew began the manual extension procedure immediately, working the hand cranks that would force the gear down through mechanical linkage alone, bypassing the failed hydraulic system entirely. The procedure was slow and physically exhausting, especially at altitude where oxygen-depleted air made any physical exertion dangerous. But gradually, stubbornly, the gear came down. First the main gear, then the nose wheel. The indicators finally shifted to showdown and locked positions. One problem solved. The flaps remained highly problematic. Without hydraulic pressure, flap extension required an emergency procedure using compressed air bottles. These bottles had strictly limited capacity, enough for exactly one extension cycle. If the flaps failed to extend, or if they extended unevenly, the landing would become significantly more challenging, possibly impossible. Lawley committed to the approach. He identified the nearest suitable airfield, a bomber command base with a runway long enough to accommodate a B-17 without functional brakes. He coordinated with the control tower by radio, communicating the emergency through the damaged intercom system that relayed messages to the radio operator. The approach began under the worst possible conditions. Airspeed was dangerously high because the flaps extended only partially. The asymmetric thrust from the two operating engines required constant correction to prevent the aircraft from veering off course. The control column remained slick with blood, both Murphy's and Lawley's own. The shattered windscreen admitted a continuous blast of freezing air that made reading instruments difficult and hearing radio communications nearly impossible. The runway threshold passed beneath them. The aircraft touched down hard, but within survivable limits. The main gear absorbed the violent impact with groaning protests. The nose gear held despite the stress. The aircraft was on the ground, but without effective brakes, far from safe. The deceleration was agonizingly slow. Lawley used differential throttle and rudder pressure to keep the aircraft tracking down the runway centerline as it rolled forward with frightening momentum. The end of the runway approached with terrifying speed. The aircraft was still moving at 50 miles per hour, then 40, then 30, eating up precious runway with each passing second. It finally stopped, with runway still remaining ahead. The engines wound down from their sustained roar. The propellers stuttered and fell still. For the first time in hours, hours that felt like lifetimes, the constant mechanical roar that had filled the cockpit finally ceased, replaced by an almost shocking silence. Rescue crews converged on the aircraft from all directions. Medical personnel quickly extracted the wounded with practiced efficiency. Murphy came out first, still unconscious. Then, the other crew members with injuries requiring immediate medical attention. Lawley remained in his seat until hands gently guided him out, his own wounds now demanding the treatment he had refused to prioritize during the flight. The crew had survived. Every single man who had boarded that aircraft that morning in England walked away from it that afternoon, or was carefully carried away. None died in the air. None died during the landing. None was captured or lost, not one. The aircraft itself stood as a monument to destruction. Maintenance crews who examined it later counted over 300 holes punched through the fuselage and wings. Control cables were severed in multiple places, with remaining strands bearing loads they were never designed to carry alone. The No. 3 engine was burned beyond any hope of recognition or repair. The No. 1 engine was frozen solid from complete oil starvation. Structurally, by every engineering principle, the aircraft should not have remained intact. Aerodynamically, by every calculation, the aircraft should not have remained flyable. Statistically, by every probability model, the crew should not have survived. But statistics describe populations and averages, not individual cases and specific outcomes. Lawley had refused to accept the statistical outcome that probability demanded. He had imposed a different outcome entirely through sustained physical effort across hours of unrelenting pain, bone-deep cold, and constantly diminishing options. He had chosen to fly when every rational calculation said to bail out, to give up, to accept the inevitable. The Medal of Honor citation for First Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr. was officially approved on August 4, 1944. The language was formal, precise, and deliberately understated in the manner of all official military documents. It described the events of February 20th in declarative sentences that conveyed established facts without emotional embellishment. The citation noted that Lawley had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned the crippled aircraft, the wounded co-pilot, the decision not to abandon the aircraft, and the successful return to base. These were the facts, stated clearly and without elaboration. But the citation did not, could not, describe the specific physical sensation of holding that control column for 3 continuous hours with a severely wounded hand. It didn't mention the penetrating cold that cut through the shattered windscreen at temperatures sufficient to cause frostbite within minutes of exposure. It didn't attempt to quantify the blood loss that left Lawley barely clinging to consciousness by the time the aircraft finally touched down on English soil. The gap between official language and lived experience was vast and ultimately unbridgeable. Citations existed to communicate institutional recognition in formal terms. They were never designed to capture the actual texture of sustained fear, the crushing weight of uncertainty, or the true physical cost of maintaining effort under conditions that exceeded all human design specifications. Lawley received his medal from President Franklin D. Roosevelt at a White House ceremony attended by military dignitaries and press. The photograph from that day shows a young man in immaculate dress uniform, slim and composed, accepting recognition for an event that no photograph could possibly depict. The image successfully conveyed honor, formal ceremony, and national gratitude, but it could never convey what it actually felt like to know that 9 other men continued breathing because of a decision made in mere seconds and then sustained across hours of agony. That knowledge lived somewhere beyond the reach of cameras or official language. The other crewmen received their own recognition as well. Technical Sergeant Henry Mason, who had courageously left his turret position to provide aid to the wounded co-pilot, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The other crew members received Air Medals and Purple Hearts, according to the nature of their injuries and actions during the mission. Lieutenant Murphy survived his wounds. The injuries that by all medical logic should have killed him proved survivable with immediate medical attention and subsequent intensive treatment. He eventually returned to operational duty, another young man carrying invisible damage through the remainder of a war that had absolutely no patience for recovery or healing. Lawley flew again as well. The administrative machinery of the 8th Air Force processed wounded pilots back into operational status according to medical clearance and operational necessity. Lawley completed additional combat missions before the administrative decision to reassign him to non-combat duties finally recognized that some experiences exceeded reasonable repetition. Some things could not, should not, be asked of a man twice. After the war finally ended, Lawley returned to Alabama. He married, raised children, and lived what appeared to be the unremarkable life of a man who had experienced something that utterly defied explanation and consciously chose not to explain it. The Medal of Honor entitled him to certain privileges and formal recognitions, but he rarely sought them out or made use of them. He died in 1999, having lived well into an era when the B-17 Flying Fortress existed only in museums and in the fading memories of old men. His name appears on the official rolls of Medal of Honor recipients, one entry among hundreds from the Second World War. The entry provides basic facts: name, rank, date, location, general description of action performed, but it does not, cannot, provide the specific knowledge of what it actually feels like to hold a dying aircraft in the air through nothing but will and bleeding hands when every sensible calculation demands you let it fall. That knowledge died with the men who lived it. The crews of the 8th Air Force suffered catastrophic losses during the war. Over 26,000 men were killed in action. Another 8,000 were wounded, many permanently. Another 18,000 became prisoners of war, enduring conditions that broke many who survived them. The statistical probability of surviving a complete tour, initially 25 missions, later raised to 30, then 35, as the air war intensified beyond all predictions, was calculated at various points throughout the war to be less than 30%. The men who flew understood these numbers intimately. They lived with the statistics every day, watching empty chairs appear at breakfast, watching hard stands remain empty after missions. Yet they continued to fly anyway, not because they somehow ignored the mathematics of death, but because the mathematics applied to groups and populations, not to individuals and specific men. Each man carried some private calculus of survival that allowed him to climb into the aircraft one more time, to face the odds one more mission. Lawley's personal calculus on February 20th, 1944, produced a radically different equation than doctrine prescribed. Doctrine said, bail out immediately. Doctrine said, accept the unavoidable loss. Doctrine said, save who you can realistically save and let physics claim the rest without guilt. But Lawley's equation included a variable that standard doctrine did not account for: the specific weight of one unconscious man strapped in the right seat, a man whose survival depended entirely on whether the left seater chose to keep flying or chose to let the aircraft fall. Lawley chose to fly. He chose to hold on when letting go was the only rational choice. The choice wasn't heroic in the conventional sense of conscious selflessness or performed valor for witnesses. It was immediate, physical, and sustained through progressively degrading conditions that would have justified abandonment at virtually any point during those hours. The aircraft that finally landed at that English base that afternoon was fundamentally not the same aircraft that had taken off that morning. It was held together by structural margins that should have failed catastrophically, sustained by control inputs that should have been physically impossible to maintain. It flew because one man refused to accept that it could not fly, and he somehow transmitted that refusal through his hands and feet directly into the machine until the machine itself seemed to believe it too. There exists no technical explanation in any flight manual for that transmission. Standard flight manuals simply do not account for the phenomenon of an aircraft flying beyond its established design limits because its pilot would not permit otherwise. Yet the men who maintained and flew the B-17 Flying Fortress knew from direct experience that such phenomena occurred with disturbing regularity. They occurred in that undefined space between what careful engineering predicted and what desperate combat demanded, the space where human will intersected with mechanical capability, and sometimes, inexplicably, prevailed against all reasonable odds. The German defenders who tracked Lawley's aircraft across the Reich that day through their scopes and plotting tables observed a bomber that by every tactical principle should have fallen from the sky. It did not fall. It burned and bled and descended through altitudes that should have marked its final moments. Yet it continued flying westward, stubbornly, impossibly, until it reached friendly territory and landed and yielded up its crew alive. The machinery of air defense, sophisticated as it was, had no category in its manuals for such outcomes. Neither, ultimately, did the official language of military citations and formal recognition. But the 10 men who walked away from that shattered aircraft on English soil knew exactly what category applied to what they had witnessed and experienced. It was the category of one pilot who simply refused to let go of the controls when letting go was the only sensible thing remaining to do. When all logic, all training, all doctrine said to bail out and save yourself, he held on instead. William Lawley held on with bleeding hands and failing strength across hours of impossible flight. That single fact represents the complete statement of what happened over Germany on February 20th, 1944. No additional explanation improves upon it. No further words can add meaning to that simple truth. He held on, and 10 men lived who should have died. That is the story entire.